$500. That was the fine. For tire tracks in the snow on a road I had been clearing for free since before half the people on that mountain even moved there. 8 years, 63 storms, not a single invoice. I had burned through $14,000 in diesel, blade maintenance, and pre-dawn hours that most people spend asleep, keeping 68 families connected to the world below. One road in, one road out, 9,000 feet above sea level in the Colorado Rockies where a buried mountain pass isn't an inconvenience, it's a medical crisis waiting to happen. And then Sandra Whitfield handed me a certified letter, cited Section 4.7 of the Revised Community Standards, referenced photographic evidence of non-conforming equipment patterns, and smiled the smile of someone who has never once needed to be useful to anyone. I took the letter, read it twice, looked at her over the top of it. "You're right," I said. "I should stop." 3 days later, she learned what 8 years of someone else's generosity had been worth. The lesson arrived in the form of a buried road, a medical helicopter, and a financial audit that unraveled everything she thought she had built. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Then stay with me, because this is the story of what happens when someone mistakes dependency for power and finds out too late which one of you actually needed the other. My name is Garrett Winslow. I'm 53 years old. I've been running heavy equipment in the Colorado high country since I was 19, when my father handed me the keys to his grader and told me that the machine would do what you asked if you understood it and would destroy you if you didn't. Good life philosophy in general. My wife Helen teaches middle school science. We bought into Summit Ridge Commons 12 years ago, for the same reason everyone moves to 9,000 feet in Colorado, because the views make you forget that you are fundamentally at the mercy of weather in ways that flatland people never have to consider. Elk in the yard. Silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. And in exchange, you accept that winter on a Colorado mountain is not a season. It is a negotiation. Summit Ridge sits at the end of a 2.4-mile private road the county doesn't touch. The HOA owns it. The HOA maintains it. Or at least, that was the arrangement before I arrived with my truck and my blade and my willingness to be out at 4:30 in the morning while everyone else was warm. The contractor the HOA had been using before me charged $900 per storm and took 4 to 6 hours to arrive. I watched him work during my first winter and recognized immediately that he was running residential equipment on a commercial road and had no particular urgency about the timing, because nobody had told him that urgency was the entire point. I had the equipment, the license, the insurance, and the professional training. I made the offer, and the board at the time, led by a man named Walt Gruber, who had the pragmatic instincts of someone who had actually spent winters at altitude, said yes before I finished the sentence. 8 years later, Walt had retired to New Mexico, and Sandra Whitfield had moved up from Phoenix with an EMBA, a Land Rover with spotless paint, and a binder full of organizational frameworks she wanted to apply to a mountain community that had been functioning on mutual reliance since before she heard of it. She ran for board president on a platform of operational professionalism and community standards accountability. She won by 6 votes. The margin of victory was 3 households that had moved in during the previous 18 months and didn't know yet what altitude did to organizational theories developed at lower elevations. The first board meeting under Sandra's leadership introduced 3 agenda items I hadn't seen before: community appearance guidelines, vendor qualification standards, and a liability review of informal service relationships. That last one was mine. The cease and desist letter arrived on a Tuesday in early December. Formal HOA letterhead with a new logo. Sandra had commissioned from a graphic designer in Denver a mountain silhouette inside a hexagon that looked like something from a luxury real estate brochure. The letter informed me that my snow removal activities constituted unauthorized operation of heavy machinery on HOA-controlled property and directed me to discontinue all such activities pending board review of vendor qualification criteria. It also reminded me that my monthly dues of $480 remained due on the 1st of each month regardless of any service disruption. I called Sandra. She explained that the board was reviewing bids from qualified professional contractors and that my services, while appreciated historically, had never been formalized through proper channels. She used the word historically twice. The second time, she put enough emphasis on it to make clear that historical arrangements were being superseded by current standards. I asked how long the review would take. She said the board expected to have a contractor in place within 4 to 6 weeks. I asked what happened if a significant storm arrived before then. She said they would manage the situation as it developed. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called my friend Lynette Morrison, who runs equipment law and contractor liability cases in Denver, and who has over the years become my first call whenever an HOA does something that feels like it has legal dimensions I'm not fully seeing. I described the situation. She asked me 3 questions, confirmed my insurance was current, and told me what I was looking at from a legal perspective if I wanted to pursue it. She also told me something that changed my approach entirely. Don't fight it yet, she said. Let them find their contractor, then document everything that happens when the first real storm arrives. The case you'll have after the first major failure is worth 10 times the case you have right now. I asked her what she meant by major failure. She said, "You'll know it when you see it. Just make sure your cameras are running." Sandra's contractor selection process took 5 weeks. The winning bid came from Summit Peak Property Services, owned and operated by a man named Colin Drake, who presented the board with a professional packet, a service agreement, liability insurance documentation, and a rate structure of $1,400 per storm plus equipment fees. Nearly double what my replacement cost would have been, triple when you factored in that I had been doing it for nothing. I attended the board meeting where the approval was announced and said nothing. I noted the vote. I noted the contract terms. I noted that Colin Drake's business had been registered with the Colorado Secretary of State 11 months earlier, and that his listed previous occupation was commercial real estate. I filed that information away. The first moderate storm arrived in late December. 8 inches, manageable, the kind of snowfall a competent operator handles in a couple of hours. Summit Peak's crew showed up 4 hours after the snow stopped, cleared the main road adequately, and sent an invoice for the base rate plus $150 in equipment fee supplements that hadn't been discussed at the approval meeting. The board approved the invoice. Sandra sent a community email praising the new professional relationship. I watched and said nothing. January brought the storm I had been waiting to see. The National Weather Service issued a blizzard warning on a Thursday afternoon. 32 to 40 inches predicted. Wind advisory. Extended duration. The kind of storm I had cleared 8 times during my 8 years at Summit Ridge, always alone, always before the road became impassable, always before the families who depended on access for medical appointments and school transportation and basic supply runs found themselves unable to move. I serviced my truck the night before. Checked every hydraulic line, changed the oil, sharpened the blade, topped off the tank. Old habit. Then I parked it in my garage and went to bed. By 6 in the morning, 22 inches had fallen, and the snow was still coming hard. I stood at my kitchen window with coffee and watched the road outside my house disappear under a surface that had no features left, just unbroken white. My phone started at 7:03. Neil Abernethy, 2 houses down, retired schoolteacher, wife on blood thinners, asking if I had heard anything about the road status. I told him to call Sandra. 7:19. Lisa Prentice, young mother with a 4-year-old who ran a fever overnight. The pediatrician's office was 40 minutes down the mountain. She wanted to know when the road would be cleared. I told her I wasn't the contractor anymore and gave her Summit Peak's number. The calls kept arriving every 10 or 15 minutes with the regularity of a clock I couldn't turn off. I gave every caller the same answer. "I'm sorry, I'm not authorized. Contact the HOA. Contact Summit Peak." At 8:45, Summit Peak's crew arrived at the bottom of the road in a truck I recognized from the December storm. They made it approximately 300 yards before the plow blade caught a compacted drift at the wrong angle, the hydraulic pressure spiked, and the mounting bracket cracked with an impact I could hear from my driveway. The truck sat there for 11 minutes with hazard lights blinking while the driver made phone calls. Then it reversed back down the mountain. By 11 o'clock, the HOA email went out. Summit Peak had experienced equipment difficulties. Road clearance was delayed. Residents should limit travel. Emergency services were aware of the access situation. Emergency services were aware, as though awareness was the same as capability. At 2:17 that afternoon, my neighbor Frank Delacroix, 71 years old, diabetic, missed appointment level critical dialysis patient, fell on ice in his driveway while attempting to clear a path to his truck. Possible hip fracture. His wife called 911. The ambulance got within 2 miles of our entrance before the depth made forward progress impossible. The fire department attempted access with their rescue vehicle. Same result. The helicopter arrived at 3:45. I watched it from my porch. The rotors beat the snow into a circular curtain around the landing point. The medics worked fast. Frank was airlifted out, stabilized, terrified, and facing a bill that would start at $30,000 before insurance began making decisions about what it was willing to cover. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Helen came and sat across from me. She didn't say "I told you so" because she doesn't operate that way. She just put her hand on mine and said, "You know what you need to do and when you need to do it. Trust the timing." Sandra's first call came at 4:08. I let it go to voicemail. She said the board wanted to discuss emergency arrangements and asked me to call back at my earliest convenience. I saved the message to a file I had created on my phone labeled documentation and went to bed. The voicemails accumulated over the next 18 hours with increasing urgency. Sandra's composed professional tone began showing strain around message 4. By message 7, the strain was gone, and something raw had taken its place. School district fines had started accruing. Colorado Education Code required guaranteed bus access for residential communities above a certain elevation, and Summit Ridge had been in violation for 31 hours. The daily penalty was substantial. The HOA was already liable for an amount that made Sandra's 4 to 6 week contractor search look like the most expensive administrative decision in Summit Ridge history. I called Lynette. She listened to my summary, asked me to read her the most recent voicemail from Sandra word for word, and told me what to demand before I touched the plow. "Everything in writing," she said. Board authorization on official letterhead. Reimbursement of $14,000 in documented expenses. Retroactive fuel payments. Written indemnification covering the unauthorized activity allegation. And a commitment signed by all board members to a public financial review at the next community meeting. That last item wasn't about the snow. Sandra called again at 6:17 the following morning. I answered this time. She asked if I would consider clearing the road given the circumstances. I told her I would. I told her what I needed in writing first. The silence on the line lasted 12 seconds. I counted. Then, "I'll talk to the board." "Sandra," I said, "it's 29 degrees and people have been trapped for 2 days. I need the email before I start the truck." The email arrived at 7:44. All 6 board member signatures. Every condition Lynette had specified, plus one line Sandra added that she probably thought was a concession, but was actually, as Lynette confirmed when I forwarded it, an admission. The fine issued in December is hereby rescinded as having been issued in error. Issued in error. I took a screenshot and backed it up in 3 places. I forwarded everything to Lynette. Then I opened my garage door, started the engine, and listened to it turn over in the cold with the deep, reliable sound of a machine that had been maintained by someone who understood it. Helen came out in her coat and got in the passenger seat. "You're coming?" I said. 8 years, she said. "I'm watching how this ends." The first pass took 35 minutes. The snow arced off the blade in curved sheets that caught the early morning light and caught me in the chest in a way I hadn't expected. There's something about doing work you're good at after being told you're not allowed to do it that hits differently than ordinary work. Every pass felt deliberate. Every cleared section felt like a statement. Behind me, doors opened. Neighbors came out bundled in coats with thermoses and stood along their driveways watching the road reappear. Neil Abernethy raised his hand when I went past. Lisa Prentice, the young mother with the sick child, had her daughter on her hip and was already headed to her car before I finished the second pass. Sandra's house was on the back section of the road. I cleared it last. When I came through her stretch, she was standing in her driveway in a down coat that probably cost $400. Watching, her Land Rover was buried to the door handles. She had the expression of someone who has just finished a calculation they don't like. I stopped the truck and got out. Helen stayed in the passenger seat, which was the right call. I walked to Sandra's mailbox and put an envelope in it. Inside was a formal invoice on contractor letterhead for services rendered 8 years of documented fuel costs, blade maintenance, and operational time totaling $14,200, plus the current day's emergency clearance at my commercial rate. Due within 30 days, I said. The authorization letter you signed makes you personally liable for contractor fees under the terms you agreed to." She looked at the envelope. She looked at me. She said, "This isn't what I agreed to." I said, "Read it again." Then I got in my truck and finished the last 200 yards of road. The financial records arrived in response to a formal open records request that Lynette filed on my behalf 1 week after the storm. 48 hours after Sandra contested the request, the Colorado HOA Oversight Office informed her that Summit Ridge's financial records were subject to mandatory disclosure under state statute and that non-compliance would generate regulatory penalties beginning on day 30. The records arrived on day 29. 312 pages, printed on heavy stock, organized in a way that suggested Sandra's attention to presentation extended even to documents she was compelled to produce against her will. Helen went through them with me over 2 evenings. She had been a bookkeeper for 9 years before switching to teaching and has a memory for financial irregularities that I have always found either reassuring or alarming depending on the context. What she found wasn't subtle once you knew what to look for. Summit Peak Property Services had been billing the HOA at the base rate plus undisclosed equipment surcharges since October. Total billing over 4 months, $41,000, for a road that had been completely impassable during its only real test. A Colorado Secretary of State search on Summit Peak confirmed the company had been registered 11 months before Sandra took office. Its listed registered agent shared a last name with Sandra's sister-in-law, a detail that appeared in her online family photos and the company filing on the same search page. The HOA's reserve fund had dropped 38% since Sandra's election. Administrative consulting fees had appeared in 7 consecutive monthly budget reports, paid to a company called Ridgecrest Management Solutions. Ridgecrest Management Solutions had been registered in Colorado 4 months after Sandra took office. The registered agent address was Sandra's home address. She was billing the HOA for managing the HOA. I sent everything to Lynette. She sent it to the Colorado Attorney General's office with a cover letter and a timeline. The community meeting I had insisted upon in the authorization letter was scheduled for March 10th. By March 6th, 3 board members had resigned citing conflicts of interest. By March 9th, Sandra had retained a private attorney. By March 10th, the meeting had been converted from a regular session into an emergency, governance review presided over by a state-appointed interim administrator named Carol Vickers, who had the efficient demeanor of someone who had cleaned up this kind of situation before and found it neither surprising nor particularly interesting. 61 of 68 households attended. Standing room at the back. The smell of bad coffee and old coat liners was the same as every community meeting I had ever sat through on that mountain, which felt right. Carol presented the audit findings without editorial commentary. The numbers were sufficient on their own. Summit Peak billing irregularities. Ridgecrest Management self-dealing. Reserve fund depletion. Total financial exposure to the HOA approximately $89,000, not including legal fees and regulatory penalties still being calculated. Sandra sat at the front table for the first 40 minutes, and then didn't. The recall vote was 79% in favor, which was 4 votes higher than the Colorado statute required, and 3 votes higher than the turnout at the meeting that had elected her. Frank Delacroix attended in a wheelchair, hip-healing, looking at the front of the room with an expression I recognized as the particular anger of someone who has had time in a hospital bed to understand exactly what happened to them. The HOA voted to compensate me for the $14,000 in documented historical expenses. The check arrived in April. I deposited it and wrote a personal check for $4,000 to the Summit Ridge Emergency Medical Fund that the new board established after the helicopter incidents named informally for Frank, who had requested that any memorial attached to his name involve other people not repeating his experience. The new board hired me officially at a rate that reflected what the work had always been worth. Proper contract, proper insurance, proper documentation. Monthly retainer plus per storm compensation. The dues actually went down once Summit Peak's billing was unwound, and Ridgecrest's consulting fees stopped appearing in the monthly budget. Sandra's regulatory situation resolved itself over the following year in ways I didn't follow closely. What I know is that she sold the house in September and that the for sale sign went up 2 days after the Attorney General's civil referral was filed. The Land Rover was not listed in the real estate photos, which meant she took it with her, or she sold it separately, or it was simply gone. I didn't ask. Colin Drake's company dissolved in June. The equipment was auctioned. His insurance carrier is apparently still sorting out the liability questions from the January storm, which I understand can take time. The Colorado legislature passed an HOA transparency bill in the following session that included mandatory financial disclosure requirements and conflict of interest provisions for board members contracting with related parties. A reporter from the Denver Post called it the most significant HOA reform legislation in 15 years and mentioned Summit Ridge in the third paragraph of her story. Bill Morrison told me it would have been in the first paragraph if I had called her back, which I hadn't, because I don't particularly want to be in newspapers. What I wanted was what I had on a Tuesday morning in early April when the last of the season's storms had passed and the road was clear and the sun was doing that specific Colorado thing where it hits the snow at the right angle and the whole mountain looks like it's made of light. Helen brought coffee out to the garage where I was doing spring maintenance on the truck. She sat on the tool chest and watched me work. "You could have cleared that road in January," she said, "before any of it happened." "I know, you chose not to." "I did." She thought about that. "Was it worth it?" I set down the wrench and looked at the truck. 8 years of work in the hydraulics, the blade, the engine that had started every morning I asked it to. Frank Delacroix's hip would heal. The community had its finances back. Sandra's system of organizational frameworks had been replaced by a board that had elected a retired civil engineer named Bev Kowalski as president, and Bev had already identified 4 maintenance improvements on the road that the previous board hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered about. "The road's still there," I said. "And now it belongs to people who understand what it takes to keep it." Helen nodded and handed me the coffee. Outside, the snow was still on the peaks, but the access road was dry and clear, graded and graveled. 2.4 miles of maintained mountain road that 68 families depended on for everything that mattered. It looked exactly like it had always looked when it was properly cared for. The way things look when the right person is doing the work for the right reasons. Leave your HOA story in the comments. The equipment fine, the rule nobody mentioned until they wanted to enforce it, the person who moved in from somewhere flat and decided mountain communities needed to be run like corporations. I read every one. Subscribe if you want more. Next week involves a building permit, a drainage easement from 1962, and a county commissioner who found out that public records are public for a reason. Keep your maintenance logs. Keep your receipts. Keep the documentation of everything you've done that nobody noticed until it stopped. They'll notice when it stops.